going to jump right into Romans 12:2, where we can see Paul talk about the transformation process of the renewing of our mind, okay? And we're going to bridge right into another letter Paul writes where he unpacks this, or at least brings us a little bit more clarity through talking about three different things Jesus taught that should fill us in on what it means to be transformed, what it means to have a renewed mind, and how a renewed mind will transform us. And he uses three things that Jesus taught to do that. So let's just go ahead and look at Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this age, okay, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Why? So that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. So, do not be conformed to this age. What does that mean, really? He's going to answer that in just a minute. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What does that mean? He's going to answer that as well. And what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God? He's going to answer all three of those things right here in Ephesians 4:21-24. Now, we're going to take our time with these three verses because there's a lot in it, and I'm not even going to unpack it fully in this video because I want to keep this short and concise as possible, but maybe I'll make another one that goes into some other aspects of this because I just think it's really awesome. It says this: assuming you heard about him and were taught, watch this, by him, by Jesus is who he's talking about. You were taught by him as the truth is in him, Jesus. What were we taught by Jesus, okay? 1, to take off your former way of life. Take off your former way of life. What is that? The old self that is corrupted by deceitful desires, okay? So that is the being conformed to this age, okay? The former way of life, the old self that's corrupted by deceitful desires, okay? If you live in that and abide in that, that is conforming to this age, okay? So that's how this touches back to Romans 12:2. Number 2, what did Jesus teach? To be renewed in the spirit of your minds. That was the second thing Jesus taught. And thirdly, to put on the new self. That's the third thing Jesus taught, okay? The new self. What's the new self? It's the one created according to God's likeness. Ooh, that's good. Where does that take us back to? That takes us back to, let's look at this real quick. Genesis 1:27. And so God created man in his own image. How cool is that? He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. Well, that's awesome. So basically what Paul's saying is the new self restores us to what we once were before the fall. But the image of God, can I have a little bit more description and color to what that looks like practically? Yes, you can. Righteousness and purity of the truth. That is God's likeness. And that's the likeness of the new self. Well, that is God's likeness, at least an aspect of it that's for the here and now. Maybe there will be other aspects of that will come in the new age with the restored bodies and all. But as for the context of what we're looking at today, this is what Paul's getting at. Righteousness, why? Why? Because righteousness correlates with the new self. The new self is a righteous self. What does that mean about the old self? It's unrighteous because it's corrupted in its deceitful desires. Okay? So to be renewed in the spirit of your minds. In the spirit of your minds. Be renewed in the spirit of your minds. So Jesus, this is something Jesus taught. The renewing of our minds. Jesus taught the renewing of our minds. Let's think through that for a minute. What did Jesus teach? Well, he taught a new way of living that requires denial of self. He taught a way of living that was founded and rooted on agape love, a particular kind of love that's very different from what we associate as love in the Western world today. Jesus taught this love that's a selfless love, a love that shows kindness and generosity towards those who don't even deserve it, our enemies. Okay? And so when we're renewed in the spirit of our minds, we begin to think different. But what is it that we're being renewed to in our minds? Well, we're being renewed from the human, carnal way of thinking to the mind of Christ himself. How cool is that? And so what Jesus is saying when he's teaching, be renewed in the spirit of your mind, he's saying, think different. See the world different. See good and define good as something different. Define bad as something different than from what you were human, your human nature was born with. Okay? And when that happens, you can now take off the former way of life because you think different. All of a sudden, this old self, which made sense to the way you thought before, doesn't make sense anymore. But a new way of living makes sense. And it's a righteous and pure way of living. And that's what Jesus is getting at when he's saying, or when he was teaching us this renewed mind, the renewed spirit of your mind. Okay? And Paul, in this text, is drawing our attention to what Jesus taught. Okay? And same with Romans 12:2. So Jesus taught three things, to summarize it. One, to take off your former way of life. Okay? What is that? Well, it's the human nature we were born into. It's the corrupted nature. It's the old self that is corrupted by deceitful desire. So really the root of the corruption and sin and unrighteousness are our desires that are actually deceitful. So we think they're good things. We think they're things we want, but we're being deceived by those desires. All right. So think of Eve in the garden. It was a desire that she was deceived into thinking was good, but it really brought death. Okay. So when we renew our minds, okay, these desires get renewed. Okay. And we begin to desire things that are in accordance or likeness to God, his righteousness and his purity of truth. Now we look back over here. Do not be conformed to this age, right? When we get all the way down, the whole point of renewing your mind is so that you will discern what is good, pleasing, and the perfect will of God. Well, I think a lot of times we can get hung up in the weeds on that when the answer is right here, his likeness, right? So this new self is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God because it's righteous and pure, and it's established in the purity of truth and his very likeness. Okay? And so this is a little bit of an unpacking of what's going on with the whole Romans 12:2, renewing of your mind and being transformed. That's why Paul's saying, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The transformation is from the old self to the new self. That's what he means by be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. Why is the renewing of your mind important? Because those desires, you begin to think differently about what you desire, and you begin to transition from the desires you had that are actually deceitful and lead to death. They lead to death, and you begin to desire new things that lead to righteousness and purity and truth, to living a life that looks just like God himself and his character and his nature. And these desires now lead to life. And that's kind of the synopsis of what Paul is getting at when he's teaching on the renewal of the mind and the three things that he says Jesus taught, which is taking off the former self, renewing your mind so you can put on the new self to look like God, the way we looked and were intended to look in Genesis 1:27 in the garden when humanity was created. I hope this has been helpful, insightful for you, and added value to you in some way, shape, or form. Until next time, God bless.